Beneath the shifting sands of time, hidden beneath layers of dust and forgotten memory, lie the ghosts of rivers that once breathed life into the ancient world. These waterways, mighty, roaring, and life-giving, carved paths through barren landscapes, turning deserts into gardens and villages into empires. But today, their names are lost, their courses erased by centuries of change. Yet their legacy remains, etched into the ruins of cities they once fed, and the stories of civilizations they helped build. Imagine standing on the banks of the Saraswati River, its waters long vanished, but its influence still echoing in the hymns of the Vedas. Or walking through the ruins of Babylon, where the Euphrates once flowed with such abundance that it inspired myths of paradise. These rivers were more than just water, they were the architects of history, the silent partners of kings and conquerors, the reason empires rose and fell. What if I told you that the greatest cities of the ancient world, places like Mohenjo-Daro, Nineveh, and Thebes, were all built on a single, fragile foundation, the rivers that sustained them? These waterways were the highways of trade, the sources of irrigation, the boundaries of kingdoms. Without them, there would be no pyramids, no ziggurats, no libraries filled with cuneiform tablets. But here's the mystery: many of these rivers vanished, their waters diverted, dried up, or buried by time. Some were victims of climate shifts, others of human engineering, their stories erased as the empires they nourished crumbled into dust. And yet, their absence still shapes our world today. The search for these lost rivers is more than just an archaeological puzzle. It's a window into how civilizations live, adapt, and sometimes disappear. So let's set out on a journey to uncover these hidden waterways, to trace their paths through history and legend. We'll follow the clues left behind ancient maps, sediment cores, satellite images, and piece together the stories of rivers that once fed millions. Along the way, we'll meet the engineers who harnessed their power, the farmers who depended on their floods, and the explorers who rediscovered their buried courses. By the end, you'll see the world differently, not just as a map of land, but as a network of vanished waters, their currents still shaping the present. Because the truth is, these lost rivers aren't really gone, they're just waiting to be found. Picture this: a world without highways, without grocery stores, without the steady hum of modern infrastructure. For ancient civilizations, rivers were all of these things and more. They weren't just convenient water sources, they were the lifeblood of entire societies, the difference between thriving and vanishing. Take Mesopotamia, cradled between the Tigris and Euphrates. Every spring, floodwaters carried rich silt across the land, transforming arid plains into fields so fertile they could feed thousands. The same floods that nourished crops also inspired some of humanity's earliest engineering feats: canals, dikes, and reservoirs, proof that where water flowed, innovation followed. But rivers did more than fill stomachs, they shaped destinies. The Nile didn't just water Egypt's crops, it dictated the rhythm of life itself. Farmers planned their years around its floods, priests used its cycles to mark sacred festivals, and pharaohs justified their divine rule by claiming control over its bounty. The river was so central to Egyptian identity that they called their land Kemet, the black land named for the dark soil the Nile deposited each year. Meanwhile, halfway across the world, the Indus River supported cities like Mohenjo-Daro, where advanced drainage systems and public baths revealed a society that didn't just depend on water but revered it. Yet this relationship between rivers and empires was fragile. When the climate shifted or rivers changed course, civilizations faced impossible choices. The Akkadian Empire, once a powerhouse fed by the Euphrates, collapsed when droughts turned farmlands to dust. The ancient city of Angkor Wat, its canals and reservoirs a marvel of hydraulic engineering, faltered when monsoon patterns shifted. Even the Romans, masters of aqueducts, couldn't defy nature forever. Their reliance on Tiber River trade routes left them vulnerable when silt clogged their ports. These stories remind us that water wasn't just a resource. It was a silent ruler capable of crowning kings or burying them beneath the sands of time. So what made some river civilizations endure while others faded? The answer lies in adaptation. The Egyptians thrived for millennia because they learned to predict the Nile's moods. The Khmer Empire built vast reservoirs called barrays to weather dry seasons. But when societies failed to listen to their rivers, when they overfarmed, overbuilt, or ignored warning signs, the water that had nurtured them became their undoing. Perhaps that's the most enduring lesson of these ancient waterways. Power doesn't come from controlling nature, but from understanding it. And sometimes the currents of history flow where the rivers lead. Among the most tantalizing mysteries of ancient India flows the story of the Saraswati River, a waterway so revered it was worshipped as a goddess, yet so elusive that for centuries, scholars debated whether it ever existed at all. The Rig Veda, one of humanity's oldest texts, describes it as Ambatame, Nadatame, Divitame, the best of rivers, the greatest of rivers, the holiest of rivers. Its banks were said to throng with poets and sages, its waters so pure they inspired divine hymns. But by the time later Vedic texts were written, the Saraswati had become a ghost, mentioned only as a river that disappeared into the desert. For generations, this was thought to be mere mythology until modern science began uncovering clues hidden beneath the sands. Satellite photos reveal what ancient scribes could never have seen: a vast paleo-channel, a dried-out riverbed winding through what's now Rajasthan and the Thar Desert. Geological surveys confirm this was once a massive river system, fed by Himalayan glaciers and monsoons, rivaling the Indus in size. Artifacts found along its coarse pottery, tools, even entire settlements tell us this wasn't just a river. It was the backbone of a forgotten branch of the Indus Valley civilization. At its peak, the Saraswati may have supported thousands of villages, its waters turning the desert into a breadbasket. So what happened to this mighty river? The Earth itself holds the answer. Tectonic shifts, possibly around 4,000 years ago, redirected its tributaries, starving the Saraswati of its source. At the same time, the monsoons weakened, turning lush plains into arid wasteland. The river's death was slow but inevitable. As the waters retreated, so did the people. Archaeologists trace a dramatic eastward migration toward the Ganges and Yamuna, a movement that may have reshaped India's cultural DNA. The hymns praising the Saraswati evolved into prayers for a river that existed only in memory, its name later transferred to a minor tributary of the Ganges. Yet its legacy endures in surprising ways. The very word Saraswati became synonymous with wisdom and art, embodying the creative force the river once represented. Even today, rituals during the Kumbh Mela reenact the ancient confluence of the Ganges, Yamuna, and the invisible Saraswati, a testament to how deeply this lost waterway is etched into India's soul. What's haunting is the realization that the Saraswati's fate mirrors our own relationship with water. Like the Harappans who relied too heavily on a single river, modern societies often take their lifelines for granted until they vanish. The difference is, we have the tools to read the warnings written in sediment and satellite data. The Saraswati story isn't just about the past. It's a map of what happens when civilizations ignore the delicate balance between humanity and the rivers that sustain us. While the Saraswati captures the imagination as a river of legend, its physical twin, the Ghaggar-Hakra, leaves behind tangible proof of its once mighty flow. Stretching across what is now northwestern India and eastern Pakistan, this ancient river system's dry bed tells a story of abundance and abandonment. Hundreds of Harappan settlements, some of the largest and most sophisticated of their time, cluster along its vanished banks like beads on a broken necklace. Cities like Kalibangan and Banawali thrived here, their grid-planned streets and advanced drainage systems hinting at a civilization that mastered water's gifts. But today, the Gagahakra is barely a whisper on the landscape, reduced to a seasonal stream that appears only after monsoon rains. What transformed this artery of life into a ghost? The answer lies in the same forces that shaped the Saraswati's fate. Sediment cores drilled from its ancient bed reveal layers of coarse, water-worn gravel, evidence of a once permanent river fed by Himalayan glaciers. But higher up, the soil tells a darker story, finer silt, then wind-blown sand, marking the moment when the waters slowed and stopped. Climate records suggest a perfect storm of disaster, weakening monsoons around 4,000 years ago, combined with tectonic shifts that stole away its headwaters. As the Gagahakra shrank, so did the cities it sustained. Archaeologists find houses abandoned with cooking pots still inside, as if people left in desperate haste. Yet the river's legacy lives on in unexpected ways. The very word Gagga may derive from Saraswati in local dialects, a linguistic fossil of its vanished twin. Farmers along its dry course still dig shallow wells where the water table remains high, a hidden reservoir left by the river's ancient path. Even modern borders follow its ghostly outline, with India and Pakistan's frontier tracing the Hakra's former bed. It's as if the land itself remembers what maps have forgotten. The Gagahakra story forces us to confront a humbling truth. No civilization, no matter how advanced, is immune to nature's whims. The Harappans built reservoirs and canals, but they couldn't stop the skies from drying or the earth from shifting. Their fate mirrors challenges we face today: overpumped aquifers, rivers dammed to exhaustion, cities sinking as groundwater vanishes. The difference is we can read the warnings etched into this lost river's bones. The Gagahakra isn't just a relic of the past, it's a mirror held up to our future. Between the restless currents of the Tigris and Euphrates, humanity took its first great leap toward civilization. These twin rivers didn't just water crops, they birthed ideas. The Sumerians, pressing cuneiform into wet clay along their banks, invented writing to record grain harvests. The Babylonians, mapping the stars from riverside ziggurats, laid the foundations of astronomy to predict floods. Every innovation, from the wheel to the first legal codes, sprouted from the fertile mud of these floodplains. But this symbiotic relationship came at a cost. The very waters that nourished Mesopotamia's fields also carried the seeds of its decline. Unlike the predictable Nile, the Tigris and Euphrates flooded violently and unpredictably. One year, their waters might arrive too late, leaving crops to wither. The next, they could surge with catastrophic force, wiping out entire villages. To survive, Mesopotamians became history's first hydraulic engineers, digging thousands of miles of canals to tame the chaos. At Ur, archaeologists have uncovered intricate sluice gates and diversion channels, proof of a society that turned water management into high art. Yet these marvels contained a fatal flaw. Every flood deposited silt, slowly choking the canals. Maintenance became a Sisyphean task, with each generation digging deeper to keep the water flowing. By the time of Babylon's zenith under Hammurabi, the problem had reached crisis levels. Tablets from his reign complain of canals so clogged that ships couldn't reach the capital. Farmers struggling with salinization from over-irrigation watched as their fields turned white with salt crust. The once fertile soil now yielded half the wheat it had centuries earlier. Even the mighty Euphrates began shifting course, abandoning cities like that had depended on its flow. The gods, it seemed, were withdrawing their favor. What's striking is how modern these ancient struggles feel. Like today's vanishing aquifers or sinking deltas, Mesopotamia's water crisis wasn't just natural, it was man-made. The difference: they lacked our hindsight. We can read their cuneiform lamentations as cautionary tales. When modern engineers divert rivers or drain marshes, we're replaying Babylon's mistakes with higher stakes. The Tigris and Euphrates still flow, but they're shadows of their former selves, dammed and diminished. Perhaps their greatest lesson isn't about controlling water, but learning to listen to it, to build with the river, not against it. After all, civilizations endure when they adapt to nature's rhythms, not when they try to outmuscle them. The Nile didn't just feed Egypt, it taught the land how to endure. While other rivers vanished or turned against their civilizations, this ribbon of blue held steady, its annual floods as reliable as the sunrise. But don't mistake that constancy for simplicity. Beneath the Nile's familiar rhythms lay an intricate dance of human ingenuity and natural forces. Every July, when floodwaters painted the valley black with fertile silt, farmers didn't just celebrate, they measured. Marks carved into temple walls show how ancient hydrologists tracked the river's rise with mathematical precision, knowing that just a few cubits too high or low could mean feast or famine. What set the Nile apart was how Egyptians listened to its whispers. They noticed how flood patterns aligned with Sirius's appearance in the night sky, weaving astronomy into agriculture. They dug basins that trapped nutrient-rich waters like sponges, creating artificial lakes that nourished crops long after the floods receded. The Fayum Oasis, 100 kilometers from the main river, became a breadbasket thanks to a single brilliant diversion, the Bar Youssef Canal, turning a desert depression into a thriving hub where pharaohs hunted hippos amid palm groves. These weren't just engineering projects, they were acts of reverence, a dialogue between people and their life-giving river. Yet even the Nile wasn't immune to change. Satellite imaging reveals ghost channels buried beneath Libya's sands, remnants of a time when branches stretched deeper into the desert. The lost city of Heracleion, now submerged in Alexandria's harbor, once stood where a now vanished tributary met the sea. These shifts weren't failures, they were adaptations. When one channel silted up, Egyptians simply moved their fields, trusting the river's next gift would come. This flexibility might explain Egypt's unmatched longevity. While Mesopotamia's empires rose and fell with their fickle rivers, the Nile's people endured because they understood their lifeline wasn't just water, it was time itself. The river taught them patience, how to plan in decades and centuries rather than seasons. Today, as the Aswan Dam tames the floods that once defined Egyptian life, we're left with a paradox. The world's most stable river survived by changing, just as its people did. Perhaps that's the real lesson carved into those temple walls, not how to control nature, but how to grow with it. The Yellow River doesn't just flow through China, it writes history with every twist of its muddy waters. For thousands of years, this river has been both creator and destroyer, gifting the North China Plain with fertile lower soil so rich it's nicknamed the cradle of civilization, then erasing entire cities with floods so catastrophic they're etched into memory as China's sorrow. The same silt that turned the land into a breadbasket for early dynasties also became their curse, piling up until the river climbed higher than the surrounding plains, held back only by precarious dikes. When those walls broke, which they often did, the Yellow River didn't just flood, it rewrote maps, swallowing villages and shifting its course by hundreds of miles overnight. Consider the legendary flood of 1148, when the river abandoned its northern channel entirely, surging south to merge with the Huai River. This wasn't just a natural disaster, it was a geopolitical earthquake. The Song dynasty, already struggling against northern invaders, watched as their granaries drowned and their capital supply routes vanished. Meanwhile, farmers along the new course faced a grim choice: rebuild in the river's path or flee. Yet within this chaos lay a paradox: the very floods that destroyed also renewed. Each layer of silt deposited by the river's tantrums made the soil even more fertile, ensuring that those who returned could plant bumper harvests. Chinese emperors understood this duality. Yu, the great mythic founder of the Syr dynasty, was said to have tamed the Yellow River not by fighting it, but by guiding its floods into canals that nourished the land. Centuries later, real-life engineers like Pan Jixun during the Ming dynasty devised sprawling systems of dikes and overflow basins, attempting to balance control with compromise. Their ingenuity was breathtaking. Some canals stretched farther than the Great Wall, but the river always had the last word. When the Yuan dynasty's rulers tried to force the Yellow River to feed their Grand Canal, sedimentation clogged both waterways, starving Beijing of grain shipments and hastening the dynasty's collapse. What makes the Yellow River's story so gripping is how it mirrors China's own cycles of unity and fragmentation. Dynasties rose when they harnessed the river's power, like the Han with their early flood warning systems. They fell when they ignored its warnings, like the Qing, whose neglected dikes unleashed a 19th century flood so vast it triggered famines and rebellions. Even today, the river's legacy looms. Modern dams have tamed its floods, but at a cost. The Yellow River now often runs dry before reaching the sea, its life-giving silt trapped behind concrete. The lesson is clear: civilizations flourish when they work with rivers, not against them. The Yellow River never asked to be worshipped or feared, only understood. Flowing through the heart of Central Asia like twin threads of life, the Amu Darya and Sadaria rivers wove together the fates of empires and the flow of history itself. Picture the bustling caravanserais of Samarkand, where merchants from Constantinople to Chang'an bartered silk and spices under domes of turquoise tile, all made possible by the water these rivers provided. The Khwarezmian Empire, a forgotten superpower of the medieval world, rose where their waters met, turning deserts into orchards so lush that Persian poets called the region the Garden of the World. Yet today, their legacy is written in dust and dried-up riverbeds, a cautionary tale of how civilizations can flourish with rivers and crumble without them. What made these waterways so extraordinary wasn't just their size, but their generosity. In a land where rainfall was scarcer than gold, the Amu Darya and Sadaria delivered meltwater from the Pamir and Tian Shan mountains like clockwork every spring. Farmers along their banks engineered qanats, underground tunnels that siphoned water without evaporation, creating oases where melons grew sweeter than honey and cotton bloomed like snow in summer. The cities they fed became crucibles of culture. Bukhara's libraries held Greek philosophy translated into Arabic, while Merv's observatories charted stars with precision unmatched for centuries. These weren't just trade hubs, they were universities of the ancient world, where Buddhism met Islam, Persian poetry mingled with Chinese astronomy, and the very idea of globalization took its first steps. Yet the river's gifts came with a fragile balance. As Silk Road cities grew thirstier, networks of canals stretched farther into the desert, each diversion weakening the river's flow. The death knell came with the Mongol invasions, not just from swords and siege engines, but from the destruction of irrigation systems that had sustained the land for generations. When Tamerlane rebuilt Samarkand's glory centuries later, even his engineers couldn't fully restore the water networks. Slowly, the deserts reclaimed what the rivers had lent. The cruelest twist came in modern times. Soviet-era cotton projects in the 1960s siphoned so much water from the Amu Darya and Syr Darya that the Aral Sea, once the fourth largest lake on Earth, shrank to a ghost of itself. Satellite images show ships stranded in salt flats, fishing villages turned to ruins, and dust storms carrying toxic pesticides from the dried seabed. It's a stark echo of the past. Just as overuse weakened the Silk Road's lifelines, today's demands threaten the river's very existence. The difference is, we can still read the old qanats buried in the sand, still hear the warnings whispered by abandoned caravanserais. These rivers didn't just carry water, they carried the future of civilizations, and their lesson is clear. When we take more than a river can give, even the mightiest empires become footnotes in the desert's endless story. Beneath the dense canopy of the Yucatan jungle, where no great rivers carved their paths, the Maya built an empire on water they couldn't even see. Unlike the Nile or the Tigris, this civilization had no mighty waterways to rely on, just rain and the hidden veins of the earth. Their secret, cenotes, those mysterious sinkholes where the limestone crust collapses to reveal turquoise pools below. To the Maya, these weren't just water sources. They were sacred portals to the underworld, places where prayers and offerings mingled with the lifeblood of their cities. But their survival depended on more than just these natural wells. Recent lidar scans have peeled back the jungle's green curtain, exposing a breathtaking network of canals, reservoirs, and cisterns, proof that the Maya were master hydrologists, turning a water-scarce land into a managed paradise. Take Tikal, one of their greatest cities. Perched on a limestone ridge, it had no rivers or lakes nearby. Yet at its peak, it supported tens of thousands of people. How? The answer lies in that Aguada's massive man-made reservoirs lined with plaster to prevent leaks, some holding over 20 million gallons of water. Engineers designed them to catch every drop of seasonal rain, channeling it through a labyrinth of stone channels that fed palaces, farms, and even remote neighborhoods. In Calakmul, archaeologists found a system of household cisterns so efficient that every rooftop became a rainwater harvester. These weren't just feats of engineering, they were acts of defiance against a landscape that seemed determined to withhold its bounty. But the Maya's brilliance carried the seeds of their fragility. Their entire system depended on predictable rains, and when those rains faltered, the consequences were catastrophic. Tree ring studies from the 9th century revealed decades of relentless drought, a slow-motion disaster that emptied reservoirs and turned cenotes into bitter, saline pits. As water vanished, so did the social contract. In the ruins of Cancrain, archaeologists uncovered a grim scene. The city's last ruler, slaughtered beside his drying reservoir, his courtiers left unburied in the streets. The very ingenuity that sustained the Maya, their ability to squeeze water from stone, left them vulnerable when the climate shifted. What makes their story so haunting is how modern it feels. Today, cities from Mexico City to Chennai pump groundwater faster than rains can replenish it, just as the Maya once did. Their reservoirs mirror our own over-engineered water systems, brilliant until the rains change course. The difference: we have the Maya's ruins as a warning. Their canals and cenotes whisper a truth we're only now confronting. No civilization, no matter how clever, is exempt from nature's laws. The Maya didn't fail because they lacked skill, they failed because even the most hidden water sources can run dry. In the heart of Central Asia's unforgiving deserts, the Murghab River once painted a ribbon of green across the sands, a lifeline so powerful it birthed one of the ancient world's greatest cities, Merv. Imagine standing in its bustling bazaars 2,000 years ago, where Persian silks mingled with Chinese porcelain, and the air hummed with a dozen languages. All this flourished because of a simple, extraordinary truth. Water, carefully harnessed, could make the desert bloom. The Murghab's waters, channeled through a spiderweb of canals, turned barren soil into fields of wheat and orchards heavy with fruit. Merv became known as the Queen of the World, a title earned not by conquest but by the ingenuity of its water masters. What made Merv's system so remarkable was its precision. Archaeologists have uncovered clay tablets detailing water allocations down to the hour, proving that every drop was measured and shared. Farmers used a network of underground tunnels called Crises, which minimized evaporation, a technology so effective it's still used in parts of the region today. The city's engineers even built massive storage reservoirs to buffer against droughts, ensuring that even in lean years, the granaries stayed full. For centuries, this balance between human need and natural limits seemed unbreakable. But then the river began to change. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the Murghab's course shifted. Some blame tectonic movements, others point to over-irrigation that sapped its strength. The canals, once life-giving arteries, began to clog with silt. As the water dwindled, so did Merv's power. By the time Genghis Khan's armies arrived in the 13th century, the city was already a shadow of its former self. The Mongols didn't just sack Merv, they shattered a system already teetering on the edge. Today, the ruins stand encircled by dunes, a stark monument to what happens when water management becomes water exploitation. Merv's fate echoes eerily in modern crises like the Aral Sea disaster or California's shrinking aquifers. The lesson isn't that desert civilizations are doomed, it's that they thrive only when they respect water's limits. Ancient Merv's engineers understood this until ambition outpaced wisdom. Their legacy isn't just in the crumbling walls of the city, but in the stubborn patches of green still clinging to the Murghab's banks, proof that even in the harshest landscapes, water writes the story of survival. The Jordan River flows through history as much as through land, its waters steeped in prophecy, its banks witness to both miracles and wars. For 3,000 years, this modest river, barely a trickle compared to the Nile or the Tigris, held outsized power over the fate of nations. Its fertile valley was the breadbasket of biblical kingdoms, where farmers coaxed wheat and dates from soil nourished by its seasonal floods. Jericho, one of the world's oldest continuously inhabited cities, owes its existence to the Jordan Springs, while the fortress of Machaerus, where Herod imprisoned John the Baptist, stood guard over its eastern banks. But the river's true power lay in its symbolism. To cross the Jordan was to enter the promised land. To bathe in its waters, as Naaman did, was to be cleansed of affliction. This wasn't just a waterway, it was a threshold between the earthly and the divine. Yet the Jordan's blessings were always fragile. Unlike the mighty rivers of Mesopotamia, its flow depended on capricious winter rains and snowmelt from Mount Hermon. Ancient engineers, from the Israelites to the Nabateans, built intricate terracing and diversion channels to capture every drop, but drought could still turn thriving fields to dust. The Moabite stone, a 9th century B.C.E. inscription, boasts how King Mesha of Moab sabotaged Israel's irrigation systems during war, an early example of water as a weapon. Even in times of peace, the river's scarcity bred tension. The Roman historian Josephus wrote of skirmishes between Jewish and Samaritan farmers over diverted streams, proving that conflicts over the Jordan's waters are as old as civilization itself. What's startling is how little has changed. Today, the Jordan is a shadow of its former self, its flow reduced by 90% since the mid-20th century, its lower stretches choked with sewage and agricultural runoff. Dams in Syria, Jordan, and Israel siphon its tributaries for crops and drinking water, while the Dead Sea, once fed by the Jordan, shrinks by over a meter each year. The river that once parted for profits now struggles to reach the sea, but just as in antiquity, its dwindling waters still dictate power. Modern treaties like the 1994 Israel-Jordan peace agreement hinge on water-sharing clauses, and tensions flare whenever drought tightens its grip. Palestinian farmers in the West Bank watch as their olive groves wither, while Israeli and Jordanian officials debate allocations in tense meetings. The Jordan story is a stark reminder that water scarcity isn't just an environmental issue, it's a tinderbox. Ancient conflicts over this river were rehearsals for today's crises, where climate change and population growth amplify every dispute, yet there's hope in the old ways. Recent projects like the Red Sea-Dead Sea Conduit echo ancient Nabatean rainwater harvesting, proving that cooperation is possible when survival is at stake. The Jordan's waters may be diminished, but their lessons run deep. Civilizations that share their rivers endure, while those that fight over them risk sharing the fate of the dried-up riverbeds they leave behind. The Rio Grande didn't just carve canyons, it shaped civilizations. Stretching from Colorado's snow-capped peaks to the Gulf of Mexico, this river's brown waters once fed cultures as sophisticated as any along the Nile or Indus. In New Mexico's arid high desert, the ancestral Pueblones engineered irrigation canals so precise they'd put modern agronomists to shame. At places like Puy Cliffs and Bandelier, you can still trace their handiwork, stone-lined channels diverting river water to terraced fields where corn, beans, and squash grew in the shadow of cliff dwellings. These weren't just farmers, they were hydrologists who understood that in the desert, water was more precious than gold. But the Rio Grande giveth, and the Rio Grande taketh away. Tree rings from ancient timbers tell a grim story, decades-long droughts in the 1200s that turned flowing canals to dusty trenches. At Gran Quivira, a once thriving Pueblo site, archaeologists found abandoned grinding stones still perched beside dry fields, as if their owners expected the rains to return any day. The river's flow became erratic, its tributaries shrinking like veins in a dehydrated body. Some communities adapted, building check dams to trap precious runoff. Others made the heart-wrenching choice to migrate, leaving behind stone towers that now stand sentinel over arroyos where water last flowed 7 centuries ago. What's haunting is how these ancient water crises mirror modern ones. Today, the Rio Grande is a shadow of its former self, its waters siphoned by cities and farms, its lower stretches often reduced to a toxic trickle by the time it reaches Mexico. The same tensions that once drove Pueblones to abandon their homes now play out in courtrooms where states battle over water rights, yet hidden in the river's past are solutions. The ancestral Pueblones practiced dry farming, planting crops deep enough to tap residual soil moisture. They built waffle gardens, small, sunken plots with raised edges that trapped every raindrop. These weren't just survival tactics, they were acts of reverence for a river that demanded respect. The Rio Grande's greatest lesson might be its humbling paradox. This river that once supported tens of thousands now struggles to sustain its own ecosystem. But walk its banks at dawn when the light paints the canyon walls gold, and you'll feel the echoes of something profound. The same waters that once filled Puebloan pottery still whisper through the cottonwoods, a reminder that rivers don't belong to civilizations, civilizations belong to rivers. And sometimes the most advanced societies aren't those that conquer nature, but those that learn to listen to it. In the heart of Iran's desert, where the air shimmers with heat, the Zayanday-Rud River once painted a ribbon of blue across the sand, a lifeline so vital that Isfahan, the jewel of Persia, rose along its banks. Picture the 17th century when this river flowed beneath the arches of the Coc Pol Bridge, its 33 spans reflecting in the water like a row of golden halos. Gardens lush with pomegranates and roses sprawled along its course, fed by an ingenious network of canals called madi. The river didn't just quench thirst, it inspired art, poetry, and a way of life. Persian miniatures show nobles picnicking by its shores, while the hum of water wheels filled the air, turning grain mills that fed the city. The Zayanday-Rud was more than a river, it was the pulse of a civilization. Yet today, those same bridges stand like skeletons over cracked earth, their reflections lost to the sun. For most of the year, the riverbed lies parched, its waters siphoned off by dams and diverted to distant farms and factories. The madi canals, once marvels of engineering, now snake through neighborhoods like dry scars. Farmers who once grew saffron and melons watch their fields turn to dust, while the famous gardens of Isfahan, once so lush they were called half the world, now rely on trucks hauling water. The Zayanday-Rud's decline isn't just an environmental crisis, it's the unraveling of a cultural tapestry woven over centuries. What makes this loss so poignant is how preventable it was. Ancient Persians mastered water management with technologies that still astonish. Their qanats, underground tunnels that tapped mountain aquifers without wasting a drop, sustained cities for millennia. The Zayanday-Rud's flow was meticulously allocated by water courts, where elders resolved disputes with a fairness that kept the system intact. But modern interventions ignored these lessons. Dams built in the 20th century disrupted natural flows, while unchecked groundwater pumping sank the land itself. The river didn't just dry up, it was engineered into oblivion. Now, as tensions rise over dwindling water, some are turning back to the old ways. Scientists study qanat systems for clues to sustainable irrigation, while activists campaign to restore the river's historic allocations. The question isn't just whether the Zayanday-Rud can be saved, it's whether we'll heed the wisdom of those who once thrived in harmony with it, because rivers don't vanish overnight. They fade slowly, betrayed by the very civilizations they built, and their ghosts, like the empty arches of Isfahan's bridges, remind us that water is never just water. It's memory, identity, and a mirror of our choices. Deep in China's Xinjiang region, where the Taklamakan Desert stretches endlessly under a blistering sun, the ghost rivers of the Tarim Basin whisper secrets of a lost world. This was once a land of abundance, where snowmelt from the Tian Shan and Kunlun mountains fed mighty waterways like the Tarim River, creating a necklace of lush oases along the Silk Road. Cities like Lulan and Nia thrived here, their streets bustling with merchants trading jade, spices, and silk. But today, these settlements lie half buried in the dunes, their wooden pillars jutting from the sand like skeletal fingers. The rivers that gave them life have retreated, leaving behind only dry channels and the occasional salt-encrusted lake. What transformed this thriving network into a desert graveyard? The answer lies in a perfect storm of natural shifts and human choices. Core samples drilled from the basin's sediments reveal a grim timeline around 2,000 years ago. The climate began to dry, with monsoon rains weakening and glaciers retreating. Yet nature wasn't the only culprit. The very irrigation systems that made these cities possible also sealed their fate. Ancient farmers dug vast networks of canals to divert water for cotton and wheat fields, unaware that each diversion starved the rivers downstream. Over centuries, the Tarim River shrank, its delta withering like a plant cut off from its roots. By the time the Tang dynasty chroniclers wrote of Lulan, it was already a ghost town, its wells choked with sand. But the desert guards its treasures jealously. In the early 20th century, explorers like Aurel Stein stumbled upon Lulan's ruins and found mummies so perfectly preserved by the arid climate that their eyelashes still fluttered in the wind. These weren't just bodies, they were time capsules. One mummy, the so-called Beauty of Lulan, wore a finely woven woolen cloak and leather boots, her features suggesting she belonged to an ancient Caucasian people who migrated here millennia before the Silk Road. Nearby, archaeologists uncovered wooden tablets inscribed in Kharosthi script, a language lost to time, detailing taxes paid in camels and grain. Each discovery hints at a cosmopolitan world where East and West mingled long before history books recorded it. The Taklamakan's buried secrets aren't just relics, they're warnings. Satellite images show the Tarim River's modern plight. Its waters siphoned for industrial cotton farms, its lower reaches now a toxic wasteland of pesticide runoff. The same mistakes that doomed Lulan are repeating, but with higher stakes. Yet there's hope in the old ways. Some farmers are reviving ancient Crises irrigation underground tunnels that minimize evaporation, while scientists study the desert's natural hydrology to restore balance. The ghost rivers of the Tarim Basin remind us that civilizations don't vanish overnight. They fade when we forget that rivers aren't just resources, they're lifelines, as fragile as they are powerful. And sometimes the most valuable treasures aren't gold or silk, but the lessons written in sand and stone. The Okavango Delta today is a shimmering oasis in the heart of the Kalahari, a labyrinth of channels and islands where elephants wade through lily pads and herons stalk fish in the shallows. But this watery paradise is just a fragment of what once existed. Beneath the delta's tranquil surface lies evidence of a far grander river system, one that once stretched across southern Africa like a life-giving hand. Ancient riverbeds, now buried under layers of sand, tell the story of a time when the Okavango didn't end in this inland delta but flowed onward, feeding lakes and wetlands that sustained some of Africa's earliest civilizations. Take the ruins of Great Zimbabwe, that sprawling stone city whose towers still rise mysteriously from the savannah. Archaeologists have long puzzled over how this thriving metropolis supported a population of nearly 20,000 in what's now a dry landscape. The answer may lie in pollen samples dug from nearby sediment caused traces of plants that only grow near permanent water. These tiny fossils suggest that when Great Zimbabwe flourished between the 11th and 15th centuries, the region was crisscrossed by rivers long since vanished. Some researchers believe these waterways were part of the Okavango's ancient network, diverted by tectonic shifts or climate change. The clues don't stop there. Satellite imagery reveals faint scars on the Earth paleochannels snaking across Botswana and Namibia, marking where water once flowed. In some spots, these ghost rivers align perfectly with ancient trade routes, suggesting that commerce followed the water. Even more intriguing are the fish bones found hundreds of miles from any modern river, unearthed at Iron Age sites like Mapungubwe. These aren't just any fish, they're species that only live in the Okavango system, proof that its waters once reached far beyond their current bounds. So what changed? The story written in the sediment is one of slow transformation. Around 3,000 years ago, shifts in the African monsoon weakened rains, while geological uplift in the region's grabens rift valleys altered drainage patterns. The Okavango's waters, once free to journey eastward, began pooling in the depression that now forms the delta. For the people who depended on these waterways, adaptation wasn't just a choice, it was survival. Some communities dug wells deeper into the earth, others moved their settlements closer to remaining springs. The builders of Great Zimbabwe mastered rainwater harvesting, constructing cleverly designed tanks to capture every precious drop. Yet even these ingenious adaptations had limits. When the last of the old rivers dried up, trade networks frayed, and the balance of power shifted. The decline of Great Zimbabwe wasn't sudden, it was a slow unraveling, a civilization adjusting to a world where water no longer flowed where it once had. Today, as climate change tightens its grip on southern Africa, the Okavango Delta itself faces an uncertain future. Its annual floods grow less predictable, its channels choke with invasive plants. The Delta's story, like that of its lost rivers, is a reminder that water shapes history, and when it vanishes, so too can the empires built upon its shores. Beneath the modern bustle of London, where taxis dart across bridges and office towers crowd the skyline, the bones of an older city lie hidden, a city shaped not by roads but by rivers. Before the Romans built their walls, before the Saxons named it Londonwick, the Thames wove through this landscape like a living map, its branches reaching into valleys now paved over by centuries of progress. Archaeologists tracing these forgotten channels have uncovered a startling truth. The river we know today is just a shadow of its former self, its original course diverted, narrowed, and tamed to fit the needs of an expanding metropolis. Take the river Fleet, now reduced to a sewer beneath London streets. In Roman times, this tributary was wide enough for ships to navigate, its banks lined with temples and warehouses. The Saxons called it the Fleot, meaning tidal inlet, a vital artery connecting settlements to the Thames. At high tide, its waters reached where St. Paul's Cathedral now stands, turning what's today the heart of the financial district into a watery fringe. Even in the Middle Ages, the Fleet was still a working river, powering mills and flushing tanneries until the city's growth slowly buried it under layers of waste and neglect. By the 1800s, it had vanished entirely, entombed in brick and forgotten by all but historians. But the Fleet is just one thread in a lost network. South of the Thames, the now vanished river Euphrates once carved a valley through Brixton and Vauxhall, its path still visible in the dip of streets like Euphrates Road. Bronze Age tribes settled along its banks, drawn by fertile soil and easy access to fishing grounds. When Romans arrived, they built a temple where the Euphrates met the Thames, a site now buried under a supermarket parking lot. These waterways weren't just convenient, they were sacred. Celtic tribes offered swords and cauldrons to the rivers, believing their depths held portals to the other world. The Thames itself has yielded more ancient weapons than any other river in Europe, a watery museum of ritual and warfare. What's most revealing about these ghost rivers isn't just where they flowed, but how they changed. When the Romans engineered London's first embankments, they didn't just control the Thames, they rewrote its relationship with the land. Marshes that once absorbed floodwaters were drained, forcing the river into a narrower channel. By the Middle Ages, the Thames had become a tool, its tides harnessed for mills, its currents dredged for shipping. The very name London may stem from a Celtic word meaning place of the bold river, but over time the river grew bolder only in its floods, bursting banks with increasing fury as its natural buffers disappeared. The echoes of these choices still ripple through modern London. When archaeologists dug beneath the Millennium Bridge, they found the remains of a Roman wharf, perfectly preserved in the mud, proof that the river's ancient docks once stood far inland from today's shoreline. Climate change now threatens to resurrect these forgotten boundaries as rising sea levels push the Thames back toward its medieval width. The city's future, it seems, is written in the same waters that shaped its past. Perhaps that's the ultimate lesson of London's lost rivers. Civilizations can bury their waterways, but they can't escape their power. The Thames remembers its old courses, and when the rains come heavy, it still dreams of reclaiming them. Standing atop Monk's Mound at Cahokia, you can almost hear the echoes of a lost metropolis. the largest city north of Mexico before the arrival of Europeans. But what's truly astonishing isn't just the scale of these earthen pyramids, it's where they're built. The ruins of Cahokia don't sit along the Mississippi River as we know it today. Instead, they cluster near the ghostly traces of an ancient channel, a reminder that this civilization didn't just live beside the river, it danced with its ever-shifting currents. The Mississippi has never been a static ribbon of water. Over centuries, it's writhed like a living thing, abandoning old channels and carving new ones. And the people of Cahokia, they didn't just survive these changes, they thrived because of them. Take the sprawling network of mounds and plazas that once housed 20,000 people. Archaeologists studying soil layers have found something remarkable. Cahokia's founders deliberately built their city atop the floodplains of an older, abandoned Mississippi Channel. These weren't just convenient flat spaces, they were fertile gardens, enriched by centuries of river silt. The Cahokians engineered a landscape of ridges and furrows that captured floodwaters when the river surged, then retained moisture during dry spells. Their crops of maize, squash, and sunflowers grew so abundantly that surplus grain filled storehouses taller than a person. But here's the twist. This agricultural paradise existed precisely because the river had moved on. The old channel's periodic floods no longer drowned the fields, yet its legacy of rich soil remained. Yet the Mississippi's moods were unpredictable. Around the year 1200, tree rings tell us droughts gripped the region for decades. The river's waters shrank and Cahokia's lifeline, a tributary called the Cahokia Creek, began to fail. The city's engineers responded with breathtaking ingenuity. They dug a series of burrow pits, quarrying clay for mounds while creating artificial ponds that stored precious water. These reservoirs doubled as sacred spaces, their surfaces mirroring the night sky in ways that aligned with celestial events. For a time, it worked, but then the river shifted again. Core samples from nearby Horseshoe Lake reveal a sudden influx of sediment around 1350, evidence of a catastrophic flood that may have overwhelmed Cahokia's defenses. Within a generation, the city emptied, its people dispersing along the Mississippi's new branches. What's haunting about Cahokia's story isn't just its collapse, but its resilience. The same adaptability that let the city flourish for centuries, the ability to read the river's whispers and respond, ultimately couldn't outpace nature's upheavals. Today, as modern engineers struggle to control the Mississippi with levees and spillways, Cahokia's mounds stand as silent teachers. They remind us that rivers aren't problems to be solved, but partners to be understood. The Cahokians didn't try to chain the river, they moved with it until they couldn't. And in that dance between human ambition and the water's will, there's a lesson for all of us who build our worlds on shifting shores. The Tigris and Euphrates never stayed still. Their restless waters carved new paths through Mesopotamia like a scribe rewriting history. One year, a city might flourish as a bustling port. The next, it could find itself stranded inland as the river slithered away. Take the ancient city of once a glittering jewel on the Euphrates banks. Cuneiform tablets describe its harbors teeming with ships from distant lands, its warehouses overflowing with lapis lazuli and cedar. But by the time of Babylon's rise, was a backwater, its docks buried under sand as the river shifted west. The same waters that had made it rich now flowed toward rival cities like Lhasa, sparking wars over control of the new trade routes. These weren't just geographical changes, they were political earthquakes. When the Tigris abandoned the Assyrian capital of Nineveh in the 7th century BCE, it didn't just inconvenience farmers, it crippled an empire. Assyrian engineers scrambled to dig canals, but the river's retreat left their granaries empty and their armies vulnerable. Within decades, the once mighty empire fell to Babylonian and Median forces, its fate sealed by a river that refused to stay put. Meanwhile, downriver, Babylon exploited the Euphrates' new course, building massive quays and dredging harbors to dominate regional trade. The river's whim had toppled one superpower and crowned another. Even diplomacy bent to the river's will. Clay tablets from Mari reveal how kings bartered water rights like gold, with treaties specifying exactly how much flow downstream cities were owed. When the Euphrates shifted toward the kingdom of Eshnana, its ruler boasted of divine favor, while his rivals accused him of secretly diverting the waters, an ancient precursor to modern water wars. The borders on cuneiform maps look rigid, but in reality, they pulsed with every change in the river's paths, as fluid as the waters themselves. Today, the legacy of these shifts is etched into the Middle East's modern conflicts. Iraq's Fertile Crescent, fed by the Tigris and Euphrates, remains a geopolitical tinderbox, with dams in Turkey and Syria threatening downstream flows. The marshes of southern Iraq, home to the ancient marsh Arabs, have shrunk and swelled with every upstream diversion, just as they did in Sumerian times. The difference now is scale. Where ancient kings fought with shovels and canals, modern nations wield concrete megadams. Yet the lesson remains the same. In Mesopotamia, water doesn't follow power, power follows water. And the rivers, as always, have the final say. The Nile we know today is just the backbone of a far grander river system, one that once stretched fingers of water into the desert, turning barren wastes into gardens. Among these forgotten waterways, none was more vital than the Bahr Youssef, a slender branch that curled west from the Nile like a tendril of life. Flowing over 200 kilometers, it fed the Fayum Depression, a vast oasis where pharaohs hunted hippos and farmers grew figs in soil so rich it yielded 3 harvests a year. Without this tributary, the Fayum would have been just another sun-baked basin. Instead, it became Egypt's breadbasket, a testament to how even the Nile's smaller veins shaped history. What made these distributaries so extraordinary wasn't just their water, it was how the Egyptians harnessed them. The Bahr Youssef didn't simply flow into the Fayum, it was meticulously engineered. During the Middle Kingdom, Pharaoh Amenemhat I ordered the construction of the Hawara Channel, a feat of hydraulics that regulated the river's flow with a series of sluice gates. This wasn't just irrigation, it was alchemy, turning seasonal floods into a perennial lifeline. The result, Lake Moeris, a vast reservoir that buffered Egypt against drought for centuries. While other civilizations collapsed when rivers shifted, Egypt endured because its engineers didn't rely on nature's whims. They adapted them, yet the Bahr Youssef was just one thread in a watery web. Satellite imagery reveals ghost channels fanning out from the Nile's eastern bank, paths where tributaries like the Wadi Tumilat once carried ships to the Red Sea. These weren't merely trade routes, they were escape valves during floods, diverting excess water that might otherwise have drowned delta farms. The Pelusiac branch, now a sandy scar in the Sinai, once nourished border forts that guarded Egypt's frontier. Even the tiniest rivulets had purpose. Papyrus marshes along lesser channels provided raw material for paper, boats, and roofs, proving that no drop of Nile water went to waste. The tragedy is how many of these waterways vanished. The Bahr Youssef still exists, but as a shadow of its former self, its waters drained by modern agriculture. The Pelusiac branch silted up after an earthquake in the 1st century, stranding ports that had thrived since the time of Ramses. Climate change played its part too. As rains diminished over Ethiopia, the Nile's tributaries shrank like receding tide lines. But the greatest loss isn't just water, it's memory. These channels were more than irrigation ditches, they were sacred pathways. the Egyptians believed the Nile's branches mirrored the celestial rivers of the afterlife, each bend a reflection of the heavens. When a tributary dried, it wasn't just a practical blow, it was a tear in their cosmic map. Today, the Fayum's fields still bloom, but the water comes from pumps, not the Bahr Youssef's gentle flow. Modern dams have tamed the Nile's floods, severing the ancient rhythm that sustained Egypt for millennia. Perhaps that's the real lesson of these lost tributaries. Civilizations don't endure by conquering rivers, but by learning their language. The pharaohs didn't just build canals, they listened to the water's whispers, shaping their world to its cadence. And when we forget that dialogue, even the mightiest rivers can slip through our fingers, leaving only echoes in the sand. Mohenjo-Daro wasn't just a city, it was a masterpiece of hydraulic engineering. Walk its grid-planned streets today, and you'll see evidence of a civilization that worshipped water as much as it relied on it. Intricate drainage channels run beneath every lane, feeding into brick-lined sewers that would put some modern systems to shame. Public wells dotted neighborhoods like liquid lifelines, while massive reservoirs stored monsoon rains for dry seasons. This wasn't just urban planning, it was a love letter to the rivers that made life possible. But here's the haunting twist. The very waterways that birthed this metropolis eventually turned traitor, leaving its streets silent and its wells dry. The Indus River, once the lifeblood of Mohenjo-Daro, didn't just shrink, it vanished. Satellite images and sediment cores reveal a startling truth. The river's main channel, which once flowed just west of the city, abruptly shifted eastward around 1900 BCE. Some blame tectonic shifts, pointing to seismic faults that still rattle the region today. Others trace the change to climate fluctuations, as weakening monsoons starved the river of its glacial sources high in the Himalayas. But the most compelling clue lies in the city's own ruins. Archaeologists have found buildings with staircases leading nowhere, ghostly evidence of a waterfront that retreated over generations, forcing residents to rebuild further and further from the receding banks. What's chilling is how quickly the end came. At its peak, Mohenjo-Daro housed 40,000 people, its granaries bursting with barley and sesame. Then the wells began to fail. Layers of silt in the city's reservoirs tell a story of desperate last-ditch efforts, deeper excavations, narrower channels as the water table dropped. By the time the Indus fully abandoned its course, the city was already a skeleton. The Harappans didn't go down without a fight, though. In the ruins of a pottery workshop, researchers found hundreds of unfired clay tablets, as if the artisans left mid-task, perhaps hoping to return when the rains came back. They never did. The real lesson of Mohenjo-Daro isn't about failure, it's about fragility. These weren't primitive people caught off guard by nature's whims. They were innovators who mastered water management centuries before Rome built its first aqueduct. Yet their brilliance couldn't outpace the Earth's restlessness. Today, as Pakistan's Sucker Barrage diverts the Indus for modern farms, history whispers a warning: rivers don't owe us their loyalty. The Harappans understood that better than anyone. Their ruins stand as monuments not to ignorance, but to the humbling truth that even the mightiest civilizations are guests in water's house, and when it changes course, so must we. The Colorado River didn't just carve the Grand Canyon, it sculpted civilizations. Long before concrete dams choked its flow, this restless waterway wove through the Southwest like a liquid lifeline, sustaining cultures that turned desert into garden. The ancestral Pueblones knew its rhythms intimately, building elaborate terrace farms along tributaries like the Little Colorado, where meltwater from the San Juan Mountains fed maize and squash crops. Hundreds of miles downstream, the Hohokam engineered something even more astonishing. Over 1,000 miles of canals, some wide enough to float a canoe, diverting the river's bounty to fields around present-day Phoenix. These weren't just ditches, they were mathematical marvels, with gradients so precise that water flowed effortlessly for miles without pumps or pipes. But the river's gifts came with brutal lessons. Tree rings from ancient timbers reveal a chilling pattern. Megadroughts lasting decades when the Colorado's flow dwindled to a trickle. At Choco Canyon, archaeologists have found sealed storage rooms packed with enough maize to feed thousands, proof of societies that planned for scarcity. The Hohokam took water conservation further, lining their canals with clay to prevent seepage and inventing trincheras, rock terraces that captured every drop of runoff. Their ingenuity kept famine at bay for centuries until even these adaptations weren't enough. By 1450, both cultures had abandoned their great settlements, scattering into smaller communities better suited to the desert's harsh new reality. What's striking is how familiar their struggles feel today. Modern Arizona still relies on Hohokam-inspired canal routes, and Puebloan dry farming techniques are being revived by drought-weary growers. Yet the parallels go deeper than technology. Just as the ancestral Puebloans watched Choco's reservoirs evaporate, today's Lake Powell and Lake Mead sit at historic lows, their bathtub rings exposing rock last seen when those ancient farmers departed. The difference, while the Hohokam could migrate to surviving waterways, 40 million people now depend on a river that's over-allocated by 20%. The Colorado's past holds uncomfortable truths about resilience. Sediment cores from its delta show it once roared all the way to the Gulf of California, creating wetlands rich with clams and waterfowl, a bounty the Kakapa people relied on for millennia. Today, that delta is a dusty wasteland, its last drops siphoned off by cities and alfalfa farms. But there's hope in the old ways. Recent agreements between the U.S. and Mexico have allowed experimental pulse flows to mimic ancient flood cycles, briefly reviving patches of the delta's ecosystem. It's a reminder that rivers aren't just plumbing, they're living systems with memories. The ancestral Puebloans understood that water shapes not just landscapes, but human behavior. Their ghostly canals whisper a question we're still grappling with. Do we control the river, or does the river control us? While the Ganges flows eternal in India's spiritual imagination, its forgotten siblings rivers like the Tigris-Euphrates and the Sutlej's ancient courses once pulsed with equal significance. The Rigveda sings of the Tigris-Euphrates as a mighty stream, its banks hosting grand sacrifices and nurturing kingdoms now buried beneath dust. Satellite imagery reveals its ghostly path snaking through Haryana and Rajasthan, its bed lined with the ruins of fire altars and settlements that thrived over 3,000 years ago. This wasn't just a river, it was a sacred corridor, the western anchor of the legendary Saraswati's basin, where Vedic sages composed hymns under its murmuring shade. Yet today, its name survives only in scattered village lore and crumbling manuscripts, its waters swallowed by the sands of time. What silenced these once great rivers? The answer lies in the slow dance of geology and climate. The Tigris-Euphrates' decline mirrors the Saraswati's fate. Tectonic shifts in the Himalayas starved it of glacial melt, while changing monsoon patterns parched its tributaries. But human hands played a role too. Ancient canals dug to divert its waters for agriculture may have accelerated its demise, leaving fields to wither when the river could no longer replenish itself. Near the lost city of Rakhigarhi, archaeologists find wells dug deeper and deeper through successive layers of settlement, a silent testament to generations chasing a vanishing water table. The Sutlej, now a thread of the Indus system, tells a different story. Once it surged eastward, merging with the Saraswati to create a fertile superhighway for trade and culture. But around 1900 BCE, it abruptly changed course, swinging west into the Indus Valley. This wasn't just a hydrological event, it was a historical pivot. The Harappan cities that depended on its waters collapsed, while new settlements like Banewali rose along its new path. The Sutlej betrayal reshaped the subcontinent's destiny, diverting the flow of people, goods, and ideas toward the Ganges basin. Yet these rivers' ghosts linger in unexpected ways. The Drishadvati's name echoes in the Drisad River, mentioned in medieval Jain texts, its sanctity preserved long after its waters disappeared. Farmers along its dry bed still whisper of cursed fields where crops fail, a folk memory of salinization from over-irrigation millennia ago. Even modern politics bear their imprint. The Sutlej's shifting waters remain a flashpoint in India-Pakistan disputes, proving that ancient rivers never truly die. They simply change form, flowing now through borders and memories instead of valleys. The lesson of these lost waterways isn't just about erosion or climate, it's about how civilizations choose to remember. The Ganges endures because it was woven into myth, its waters declared immortal by scripture. The Drishadvati, though equally vital, faded because its stories weren't written in stone but in silt, waiting for satellites and shovels to resurrect them. Perhaps that's the fate of all rivers, to be forgotten unless someone keeps singing their name. And somewhere beneath the dust, the Drishadvati still murmurs, waiting for its next hymn. The Rhine and Danube didn't just carve valleys, they carved empires. These rivers were the original highways of Europe, their currents ferrying everything from Roman legions to medieval spice caravans. But if you walked their banks today, you'd miss half the story. Time has rewritten their paths, leaving old ports stranded miles from water and silted-up channels hiding the footprints of forgotten trade hubs. Take Regensburg, the medieval gem on the Danube. Its stone bridge, completed in the 12th century, was once a bustling nexus where Venetian glass met Russian furs. Today, the river has shifted so far that the original docks lie buried under a parking lot, their wooden pilings poking through the asphalt like broken teeth. The Rhine's transformation is even more dramatic. Roman maps show a river braided into multiple branches, its delta sprawled across what's now the Netherlands. Ports like Dorstad, once the Amazon of the Viking Age, thrived where these waterways met. But as settlers drained marshes and built dikes, the Rhine straightened into a single channel, abandoning its old routes. Modern cargo ships glide past the ghostly outlines of medieval harbors, unaware that beneath the fields to their east, silt-packed canals still trace the paths of ships that carried Charlemagne's treasures. What's astonishing isn't just how these rivers moved, but why. The Danube's bends near Visegrad, Hungary, once cradled a thriving Ottoman river fleet. Then, in the 18th century, engineers cut a shortcut to speed up trade. The old loop silted up overnight, stranding warships that had patrolled there for centuries. Similarly, the Rhine's infamous Loreley Bend was once a death trap for boats until dynamite-wielding 19th century laborers blasted it into submission. These weren't natural changes, they were calculated gambles, trading ecological complexity for economic control. The real magic lies in what these shifts conceal. Dendrochronologists studying wood from Roman Danube ships found something peculiar. Timber sourced from forests hundreds of miles upstream, proving trade networks were far more extensive than records suggest. And in Cologne, workers digging a subway tunnel stumbled upon a sunken Roman barge, loaded with North African olive oil, evidence that the Rhine's forgotten branches once reached deeper into the city than anyone imagined. Perhaps the most poignant relic is the Danube limes, a chain of Roman forts now marooned inland. These outposts were built to control river traffic, but as the Danube meandered, their strategic value evaporated. Walking among their ruins, you can almost hear the shouts of soldiers who once watched the water's edge. now a distant glimmer beyond acres of wheat. These rivers teach us that trade routes aren't fixed, they're conversations between water and ambition. The Rhine and Danube didn't just carry goods, they shaped languages, laws, and wars. Their currents whispering secrets we're only now beginning to decode. And as climate change alters their flows once more, their next chapters may hold surprises even the Romans couldn't foresee. The Amazon rainforest, often imagined as an untouched wilderness, hides a secret beneath its emerald canopy, the skeletons of rivers that once charted entirely different courses. These prehistoric waterways, now buried under centuries of sediment and growth, were the lifeblood of civilizations we're only beginning to understand. Recent LiDAR surveys, slicing through the dense foliage with laser precision, have revealed sprawling earthworks, canals, causeways, and even ceremonial mounds aligned with ghost rivers long since vanished from maps. These aren't random scars on the landscape. They're the fingerprints of societies that thrived by mastering the art of living with water's whims. Take the vast geometric earthworks near the modern-day Xingu River. These formations, invisible from the ground, trace the edges of what was once a sprawling network of wetlands and channels. Archaeologists now believe these were more than just flood controls. They were part of a sophisticated agro-ecological system. The ancient peoples here didn't just adapt to the Amazon's waters, they sculpted them, creating islands of fertile soil raised above seasonal floods and interconnected by canals that doubled as transportation routes. Fish swam these waterways, their nutrients enriching the soil, while the canals themselves acted as heat sinks, creating microclimates that extended growing seasons. This wasn't just survival, it was a form of landscape alchemy, turning the rainforest's perceived chaos into a managed mosaic of abundance. But why did these rivers shift? The answer lies in a dance of mud and time. The Amazon basin, built on layers of sediment deposited over millennia, is geologically restless. Earthquakes, subtle but frequent, can reroute entire river systems overnight. Climate shifts played a role too during drier periods. Smaller tributaries vanished, forcing communities to cluster around remaining waterways. The rise of the Andes Mountains, still growing today, tilted the basin's gradient, sending rivers like the Madara and Tapajos on new journeys. These changes weren't just geological events, they were cultural turning points. When the Purus River abandoned one of its major branches around 800 CE, the densely populated settlements along its banks didn't just move, they transformed, shifting from centralized cities to decentralized villages better suited to the fractured landscape. The most haunting evidence of these lost rivers isn't in the soil, but in the stories. Indigenous oral histories speak of a time when rivers walked, their courses changing as capriciously as the wind. The Yanomami tell of a great serpent, the creator of waterways, whose movements shaped the land. Modern hydrologists mapping ancient channels have found these myths often align eerily with real paleo riverbeds. It's as if the land itself remembers what science is only now rediscovering. What's most striking is how these ancient adaptations echo modern challenges. Today, as deforestation alters rainfall patterns and dams fragment the Amazon's rivers, we're witnessing a new era of hydrological upheaval. The difference is scale. Where prehistoric societies moved with the rivers, we try to force them into submission. The earthworks uncovered by LiDAR aren't just relics, they're blueprints for resilience, proving that the greatest civilizations aren't those that conquer nature, but those that learn to read its currents. The Amazon's ghost rivers whisper a truth we're only beginning to hear. Water doesn't follow human borders, it writes them, and when it changes its mind, so must we. The echoes of these lost rivers aren't just whispers from the past, they're urgent lessons written in water and stone. Take the fate of the Indus and the Maya cenotes, civilizations that thrived for centuries by mastering water management, only to crumble when they pushed those systems beyond their limits. Sound familiar today, from the Colorado River's dwindling reservoirs to the sinking aquifers beneath Mexico City? We're replaying the same story with higher stakes. The difference: ancient societies didn't have satellite imagery or climate models to foresee collapse. We do. Consider the parallels. The Akkadians watched their empire starve when the Euphrates floods faltered. Today, California's Central Valley, America's breadbasket, sinks as groundwater is pumped faster than rains can replenish it. The Khmer Empire's barrays, those massive reservoirs at Angkor Wat, functioned flawlessly until monsoon patterns shifted. Now, modern megacities from Jakarta to Miami face rising seas and saltwater intrusion, their concrete barriers as vulnerable as ancient earthworks. Even the Romans, with their famed aqueducts, learned the hard way that over-reliance on a single water source is risky, a lesson Cape Town confronted during its 2018 Day Zero crisis when taps nearly ran dry. But here's the hopeful twist. Buried in these ancient failures are blueprints for resilience. The Hohokam's canal systems, designed to lose minimal water to evaporation, inspire today's drip irrigation in Israel's Negev desert. The Qanats of Persia, which cooled water as it flowed underground, are being revived in Oman to combat desertification. Even the Cahokians' ridge and furrow farming, which trapped rainfall like a sponge, is being adapted by regenerative farmers to rebuild drought-resistant soils. These aren't just historical curiosities, they are proven technologies, time-tested by millennia of trial and error. The real challenge isn't technological, it's philosophical. Ancient societies viewed rivers as living entities, often deifying them as gods to be appeased. We've reduced them to plumbing resources to be tapped, diverted, and commodified. Yet as climate change intensifies, that mindset is proving disastrous. Australia's Murray-Darling Basin, over-allocated for agriculture, now sees fish kills by the millions during droughts. The Aral Sea, sacrificed for Soviet cotton, birthed toxic dust storms that plague generations. These aren't just environmental tragedies, they're failures of imagination, repeating the myopia that doomed Mesopotamia's silt-choked canals. So what's the way forward? The answer lies in hybrid wisdom, pairing ancient respect for water's limits with modern science. In Rajasthan, villagers have revived dried-up wells by restoring traditional johads, small earthen dams that mimic natural watersheds. In Louisiana, engineers are breaching levees to let the Mississippi rebuild wetlands, just as the Cahokians once worked with, not against, their river's floods. Even mega projects like China's South-North water transfer could learn from the Ancient Merv's decentralized reservoirs, which stored water across landscapes instead of funneling it into brittle, centralized systems. The lost rivers of history offer a choice: adapt or collapse. But they also remind us that adaptation isn't about retreat, it's about realignment. The Saraswati's people migrated east to the Ganges. The Hohokam's descendants became the Tohono O'odham, thriving in deserts through intimate knowledge of ephemeral streams. Water always finds a way. The question is whether we'll follow its lead or, like the rulers of or Mohenjo-Daro, cling to solutions that no longer serve us until it's too late. The rivers of the past flow through our future. Their lessons aren't etched in clay tablets, but in the choices we make today. The silent ghosts of these lost rivers speak to us across millennia, their dried-up channels etched into the earth like scars, or perhaps like blueprints. They remind us that water is never just H2O. It's a living contract between humanity and the planet. Think of the Saraswati's vanishing act, leaving behind hymns and dry wells, or the Euphrates' fickle meanders that toppled empires as casually as a child redirects a stream with a stick. These waterways didn't just quench thirst, they shaped laws, inspired gods, and dictated where cities would rise or fall. And yet, for all their power, they were fragile. A tectonic shift, a decade of drought, or a single misguided canal could unravel civilizations that seemed eternal. Today, we face our own water crossroads, but with a critical advantage: hindsight. We can read the layers of sediment like pages in a history book, learning from the Maya's cenotes and the Hohokam's canals. The irony is palpable: modern satellites map ancient riverbeds with precision those societies could never imagine, yet we repeat their mistakes with larger stakes. The Colorado River, drained to a trickle by thirsty cities, mirrors the fate of Mohenjo-Daro's Indus. California's sinking aquifers echo the over-pumped wells of the Harappans. But here's the difference: we know how these stories end. The real lesson isn't just about conservation, it's about humility. Ancient cultures thrived when they saw rivers as partners, not resources. The Egyptians measured the Nile's floods like priests interpreting omens. The Khmer built their barrays to work with monsoons, not against them. Contrast that with today's megadams and drained wetlands, where we've traded resilience for short-term control. Yet glimmers of the old wisdom persist. In Rajasthan, villagers revived dried rivers by restoring traditional johads, proving that ancient solutions can still heal modern wounds. Even the Ganges, despite its pollution, is being given legal personhood in India, a symbolic return to treating rivers as living entities. So what do we owe these lost waterways? Memory, for one. The Tigris-Euphrates name may have faded, but its story warns against overexploitation. The Murghab's ruins teach us that even desert empires bloom when water is respected. But more than memory, we owe them action. Protecting today's rivers isn't just an environmental cause, it's a cultural imperative, a vow to keep writing history rather than becoming footnotes in our own. The next chapter is ours to write. Will we be the civilization that listened, or the one that learned too late? As the echoes of these vanished rivers fade, they leave us with a choice, one that's as much about ethics as engineering. Because water isn't just a resource, it's a legacy. And if we listen closely, the whispers of the Saraswati, the Indus, and the Cahokians might just guide us toward a future where rivers and the civilizations they sustain endure. If this journey through the echoes of lost waterways resonated with you, let's keep the conversation flowing. Drop a comment below about which river's story moved you most. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives into history's untold currents.